The first time I realized my family had already decided what kind of woman I was allowed to be, it happened at my own retirement dinner. I am Lorraine Whitaker. I was 68 years old that night, and I was sitting at a long table in a country club outside Des Moines, smiling politely while my name was used like punctuation instead of a person. The dinner was supposedly to celebrate my 41 years at Hawthorne Agri-Supply, the company I helped build from a dusty warehouse into a regional supplier with contracts across 3 states. I was employee number 7. I trained half the executives sitting in that room. I negotiated contracts while pregnant, while grieving, while exhausted. I stayed when men left. I stabilized when systems failed. But that night, my son Mark stood up with a glass of wine and said, "My mother always knew when to step aside." Laughter followed. Warm, approving laughter. Something inside me went very still. I looked at his wife, Dana, seated beside him in a pale blue dress that cost more than my first car. She smiled without showing teeth. Her hand rested lightly on Mark's knee, claiming ownership the way she always did. I waited for Mark to correct himself, to say something about leadership or sacrifice or endurance. He didn't. Instead, he added, "She taught me that legacy isn't about holding on. It's about letting go." More applause. I smiled. I nodded. I folded my napkin. Inside, something cracked clean through. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the company's legal department informing me that my consulting role had been officially concluded. No warning, no meeting, no call. Dana had been promoted to Director of Strategic Operations 3 days earlier. That was the open loop. I just didn't know it yet. I went home that afternoon and stood in my kitchen, still wearing my work blazer, staring at the letter while the kettle screamed itself dry on the stove. The house smelled like burnt metal and lemon cleaner. I turned the burner off with a shaking hand. Mark didn't answer my call. Dana texted me an hour later. Short, polite, efficient. "We thought it was best to give you time to rest. You've earned it." Rest. That word again. The polite burial of capable women. I sat at the small breakfast table where I had balanced checkbooks, helped with homework, signed loan papers, and planned futures that didn't include me anymore. I noticed things I had ignored for years. How quiet the house had become. How few objects in it were actually mine. That evening, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were documents I never thought I'd need. Old shareholder agreements, emails forwarded and printed, notes scribbled during meetings where Dana had been present but silent, watching, learning. I hadn't saved them because I was paranoid. I saved them because I was thorough. As I sat on the edge of my bed flipping through papers that smelled faintly of dust and ink, my phone buzzed. "Mark." His voice was brisk, controlled. "Mom," he said, "Dana told me you might be upset." I closed my eyes. "Upset implies surprise," I replied. He sighed. "You're reading too much into this. It's just business." I laughed once, quietly. "Since when has business shown up at Thanksgiving?" Silence. "You'll still be part of the family," he said. "Nothing's changing." That was the first lie. I went to bed that night knowing 2 things with absolute clarity. They thought I was done, and they had no idea what I had helped build. The first Thanksgiving I wasn't invited to. I didn't cry. I noticed. I noticed because the exclusion was done with care. Mark didn't call to explain. Dana didn't text. Instead, my granddaughter Emily mentioned it casually during a phone call the week before, her voice bright and unaware. "Grandma, are you bringing your rolls again? Or is Aunt Kara doing it this year?" I held the phone a little tighter. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "Who's hosting?" There was a pause. Then confusion. "Mommy said it was just us this year," Emily replied. "She said you were busy." Busy. That word again. The convenient eraser. After we hung up, I sat very still and let the silence settle. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved through bare branches like a warning. I didn't call Mark. I didn't ask Dana for clarification. I needed to see how far they were willing to go when I stopped cushioning their choices. The answer came 3 days later in the mail. An envelope from Hawthorne Agri-Supply, thicker than the last one. Inside was a revised shareholder report. Clean, polished, efficient. My name appeared once. Former advisory consultant. Dana's name appeared 6 times. She had been granted voting authority on shares she did not own. authority that required unanimous board consent. I was the only board member who hadn't signed. My signature had been replicated, not forged crudely, recreated carefully from older documents. I felt cold then, not afraid. Cold in the way you feel when you realize someone you love has been planning against you for a very long time. I called my attorney, Richard Hale, a man I'd known for 20 years and trusted because he never softened bad news. "This isn't sloppy," he said after reviewing the documents. "This is strategic." "Is it legal?" I asked. He paused. "Not if you didn't consent." I looked out my window at the empty street. "They're treating me like an obstacle. They're treating you like a resource they think they've already extracted," he replied. That night, Mark showed up at my house unannounced. He stood in my doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the living room like he was seeing it for the first time. Maybe he was. "Dana says you're upset about the paperwork," he said. I gestured toward the couch. "Sit." He didn't. "Mom, this is just restructuring," he continued. "You taught me this. Adapt or fall behind." I picked up the shareholder report from the table and held it out. "Do you recognize this signature?" I asked. He glanced at it. Too quickly. "It looks like yours," he said. I nodded. "It does." His jaw tightened. "Dana handled the filings." I waited. "She said you agreed verbally," he added. I laughed then. Not loudly, just enough. "Mark," I said, "when have I ever agreed verbally to anything that transferred power?" He didn't answer. Instead, he did something worse. "You're being difficult," he said, "and it's making things harder for everyone." There it was, the phrase every woman hears right before she's erased. I stood and walked past him to the door. I opened it. "Leave," I said. He hesitated, then left without another word. That night, I pulled every document from the cedar chest and spread them across my dining table. Contracts, emails, timelines. I wasn't angry. I was precise. Because when people decide you're expendable, the most dangerous thing you can do is prove you're still essential. And I was just beginning. The first thing I did after Mark left my house that night was unplug the landline. It sounds small, but it wasn't. That phone had been my leash for decades. Work calls at dawn, family emergencies, Mark calling when Dana wanted something softened before it was taken. I let it go silent and felt my shoulders drop an inch. The next morning, I drove to Hawthorne Agri-Supply for the first time since my retirement. The building looked the same. Beige brick, blue sign, glass doors that reflected the sky just enough to remind you who was watching whom. I parked in my old spot. No one stopped me. Inside, the receptionist froze when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "I didn't know you were coming in." "I didn't announce myself," I replied. That was true in more ways than one. I walked past offices where people avoided eye contact. Not out of disrespect, out of fear. Dana had been efficient about that. She'd made sure my departure was framed as instability, not displacement. A woman who stayed too long, who couldn't let go. I went straight to the records room. It had always been my domain. Not because I liked paperwork, but because power leaves fingerprints. Contracts, amendments, emails CC'd and BCC'd. Dana understood optics. She didn't understand archives. I spent 3 hours copying files. Old meeting minutes, shareholder voting records, emails between Dana and the board chair, Thomas Green, sent at odd hours, phrased like suggestions, but structured like commands. Around noon, Dana appeared in the doorway. She didn't knock. "Lorraine," she said, voice calm, controlled. "You don't work here anymore." I looked up slowly. "Neither do you," I said. "Not yet." She smiled thinly. "You're causing confusion." "No," I replied. "I'm correcting it." She crossed her arms. "Mark is very concerned about you." I closed the folder I'd been reading. "Mark is concerned about inconvenience," I said. "You're concerned about exposure." Her eyes flickered. Just once. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said. "People are talking." "Good," I replied. "They should." She leaned against the doorframe. "You should enjoy retirement. Travel. Rest." I stood then. Slowly. Deliberately. "Dana," I said. "You've mistaken my silence for surrender." She laughed softly. "You don't have leverage anymore." I stepped closer. You're standing in a building whose expansion I personally financed during a drought. You're using authority granted by a signature I didn't give. And you're married to a man who doesn't know the difference. Her smile faded. You're done here, she said. I nodded. For now. When I left the building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt focused. That afternoon, I met with Richard Hale and laid everything out on his desk. Not emotion, evidence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't reassure me. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled. They're preparing a narrative, he said, about capacity, about relevance. I nodded. I know. They may attempt a conservatorship, he continued, or at least threaten one. That word landed heavy. They wouldn't, I said. Then I paused. Would they? Richard met my eyes. Dana would. I drove home in silence. That night, I received an email from Thomas Green, the board chair. Subject line: clarification. Inside, a single paragraph. There seems to be confusion regarding your status and involvement. We should meet privately to discuss next steps. Next steps. Always forward. Never accountable. I replied with one sentence. I agree. Bring counsel. His response came minutes later. Unnecessary. I smiled. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. in Thomas Green's corner office overlooking the river. I arrived early. Not because I was nervous. Because I wanted to watch who arrived with him. Dana came first. Of course she did. She sat in the chair closest to his desk, crossing her legs, scrolling through her phone like she already owned the room. Mark arrived 5 minutes later. He avoided my eyes. Thomas came last, carrying a leather folder and a look of practiced patience. Let's keep this constructive, he said as he closed the door. I nodded. That's up to you. He sat. Dana leaned forward slightly. Mark stared at the floor. Thomas cleared his throat. Lorraine, your presence here is causing disruption. I smiled faintly. Truth often does. Dana sighed. This isn't personal. I turned to her. Everything is personal when you use my name without my consent. Thomas raised a hand. Let's focus on solutions. Excellent, I said, reaching into my bag. I placed a stack of documents on the table. Here's one. Dana stiffened. What is that? She asked. Meeting minutes from 3 years ago, I replied. The one where I explicitly denied transfer of voting authority to non-shareholders. Thomas frowned as he scanned the page. That meeting didn't conclude, Dana said quickly. We revisited it later. I slid another document forward. Here's the follow-up email, where you acknowledged my refusal. Mark looked up sharply. You said Mom agreed, he said to Dana. She didn't look at him. Thomas's face tightened. Dana. She smiled again. Too fast. This is being taken out of context. I placed a third document down. And here's the signature comparison. The room went quiet. Thomas leaned back slowly. This is serious. Dana's voice sharpened. She's confused. She's been under stress. You all know that. There it was. The pivot. Mark stood abruptly. That's not fair. Dana turned to him. I'm protecting us. I watched them then. Really watched. A marriage built on alignment, not honesty. A son who had mistaken delegation for trust. Thomas rubbed his temples. We need to pause all changes until this is reviewed. Dana's head snapped toward him. You can't do that. I can, he replied. And I will. She stood. You're choosing her over progress. He looked up at her. I'm choosing legality. I gathered my papers calmly. This isn't revenge, I said, standing. It's correction. Mark finally met my eyes. What happens now? He asked. I held his gaze. Now, I said, you learn what it feels like to lose control of a story you rewrote. As I walked out of the office, I heard Dana's voice rise behind me. Sharp, angry, afraid. I didn't turn around because I knew something they didn't yet understand. This wasn't the climax. This was the moment before everything collapsed. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday, folded too carefully to be casual. It wasn't from Hawthorne Agri Supply. It wasn't from Mark or Dana. It came from a law firm in Omaha I didn't recognize. Its name printed in confident navy ink across the top. I knew what it would say before I opened it. Capacity review. Independent evaluation. Temporary safeguards. Words designed to sound neutral while stripping a person of authority. I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice, slowly. My coffee went cold beside me. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, ordinary life continuing, while someone attempted to legally define me as fragile. Richard arrived an hour later. He didn't waste time. "They're escalating," he said. "Dana's behind this, but she's using Mark's proximity." I nodded. Of course she is. The letter proposed a medical and financial review under the guise of protection. It cited concern from close family members and recent erratic behavior. Erratic. Another favorite word. "Do you know what tipped her hand?" Richard asked. I did. "She thinks I'll panic," I said. "She thinks fear will make me sloppy." Richard leaned forward. "We can fight this, but it means exposure. Depositions, subpoenas, your private life on display." I met his eyes. "I've already lived through erasure. Exposure won't scare me." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. That afternoon, I pulled out a binder I hadn't opened in years. Inside were medical records, evaluations, performance reviews, and correspondence from banks and auditors spanning decades. Clean, consistent, unimpeachable. Dana was betting on age. I was betting on documentation. 2 days later, Mark showed up again. This time, he didn't knock. He used his old key. "You can't keep doing this," he said, voice tight. "Dana's under a lot of pressure." I turned from the sink, drying my hands. "So am I." He paced the living room. "They're talking about appointing a guardian, just temporarily." "Over my objection," I said calmly. "For your protection," he insisted. I looked at him then. Really looked. The boy I raised, the man who had learned how to outsource guilt. "Mark," I said, "do you know my blood type?" He froze. "What? Do you know my blood type?" I repeated. He shook his head. "Do you know what medications I take?" "No." "Do you know how many contracts I signed last year?" He didn't answer. "You're asking the state to protect me from myself," I continued. "But you don't know the first thing about my life." His voice cracked. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said. "I'm making it accurate." He left without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from something sharper. Betrayal with a familiar face cuts differently. I lay awake listening to the house settle, thinking about how many women I'd seen pushed into silence by polite concern. How many capable lives had been quietly managed into irrelevance. By morning, I had made my decision. If Dana wanted to question my capacity, I would question her ethics, and I would do it publicly. The evaluation was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 sharp. Dana insisted on being present. I allowed it. The doctor was thorough, neutral, younger than me, but respectful. He asked about finances, daily routines, decision-making, memory. I answered clearly, calmly, without defensiveness. Dana shifted in her chair, tapping one manicured nail against her phone, whenever the conversation drifted away from weakness. After 2 hours, the doctor closed his folder. "Mrs. Whitaker shows no signs of cognitive impairment," he said. "Her executive function is above average for any age." Dana smiled tightly. "But stress can mask things." The doctor met her gaze. "Stress reveals patterns. Hers are consistent." I stood, thanked him, and left Dana sitting there with her narrative unraveling. That afternoon, Richard filed a motion. Not defensive. Offensive. We requested a full forensic audit of Hawthorne Agri-Supply's recent governance changes, including unauthorized signatures, conflicts of interest, and improper consolidation of authority. The board froze operations, pending review. Dana called me 6 times that night. I didn't answer. The next morning, the story broke quietly in the local business journal. No names yet, just questions. By Friday, Thomas Green resigned. Mark called, voice hollow. "Everything's falling apart." "No," I said. "Everything's being seen." There was a pause. "I didn't think it would go this far," he admitted. "That's because you thought this was about control," I replied. "It's about truth." The audit uncovered more than we expected. Undisclosed financial incentives, side agreements. Dana had positioned herself as indispensable, while quietly consolidating influence through procedural shortcuts. When the board reconvened, she was removed. No drama, no apology, just a unanimous vote. Mark stepped down shortly after. Not forced. Ashamed. I attended neither meeting. That chapter of my life no longer required my presence. Instead, I sat at home and began writing a letter of my own. Not to the company, not to my son, to myself. It began with a single sentence. "I am not difficult. I am precise. And for the first time since this began, I felt the shift. The balance was changing, but the cost had not yet been paid. The first Christmas after Dana's removal arrived without invitations. No group texts, no polite obligations wrapped in forced cheer. Just silence, clean and intentional. I decorated anyway. Not for tradition, not for nostalgia, but for proof. Proof that joy doesn't require witnesses to exist. I hung a single strand of white lights along the mantel. Put out the porcelain angel my mother had loved, the one with the chipped wing. I cooked for myself. Soup, bread. Nothing elaborate. On Christmas Eve, Mark called. His voice sounded older, thinner. "Mom," he said, "I don't know how to fix this." I stared at the small tree in the corner of the room, its light steady and quiet. "Fixing isn't something you do to someone else," I replied. "It's something you start inside yourself." He swallowed. Dana moved out. That landed differently than he expected. I didn't feel relief or triumph, just confirmation. "She says you turned everyone against her," he continued. "I didn't speak," I said. "I documented." Silence stretched between us. "I don't know who I am without her," he admitted. That was the truest thing he'd said in years. "I raised you to be someone," I said gently, "not someone's echo." He didn't respond. We said goodbye, without promises. After the call, I sat alone and let the quiet settle. Not as punishment, as reckoning. In January, the lawsuit became unavoidable. Dana filed first. Wrongful termination, defamation, emotional distress. Her complaint painted me as vindictive, unstable, threatened by a younger woman's competence. I read it once. Then I closed the file and handed it to Richard. "She's desperate," he said. "She's consistent," I replied. "She always needs an enemy." Depositions were scheduled. Her attorney tried to provoke me, tried to bait emotion, tried to frame me as resentful. I answered every question the same way, with facts. When asked why I resisted relinquishing authority, I said, "Because authority without accountability is theft." When asked if I felt threatened by Dana, I replied, "I felt observed." That unsettled them more than anger ever could. The deposition ended early. Outside, reporters waited. Dana avoided them. I walked past without comment. I wasn't hiding. By February, the company announced a restructuring. My shares were reinstated. My advisory role offered back. I declined. Instead, I proposed something else. A trust, independent, transparent, designed to fund leadership training for women over 50 who had been quietly sidelined in corporate transitions. The board approved it unanimously. Dana was not mentioned. That omission spoke louder than any press release. One afternoon, as I reviewed grant proposals, a knock came at my door. It was Emily. My granddaughter stood there awkwardly, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes uncertain but hopeful. "Hi, Grandma," she said. I stepped aside. "Come in." She sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd read Betrayal into existence months earlier. "Dad says you're starting something new," she said. "I am," I replied. She hesitated. "Mom says you're dangerous." I smiled softly. "And what do you think?" She shrugged. "I think people say that when they're afraid of losing control." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're smarter than they give you credit for," I said. As she left, I knew something had shifted again. Not restored, rewritten. Spring came early that year, impatient and unapologetic. The first grants from the trust were awarded in March. Small amounts, large impact. Women who had been overlooked, edged out, or quietly replaced were stepping back into rooms they'd been told no longer needed them. I attended the first seminar anonymously. I sat in the back row and listened. Stories poured out, familiar ones, being labeled difficult, resistant, emotional, too much, too old. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. They were finding their voices without me. Afterward, one woman approached me. Early 60s, steel gray hair pulled back tight. "You look like someone who understands," she said. "I do," I replied. She smiled. "That's enough." That night, Dana's lawsuit collapsed. Her former attorney withdrew, citing irreconcilable differences. A second firm declined representation. By the time the judge dismissed the case for lack of merit, she was already gone, moved out of state. No forwarding address. Mark called again. "She's blaming you," he said quietly. "Of course she is," I replied. He hesitated. "I should have protected you." I closed my eyes. "You should have listened." We met for coffee a week later. No apologies, no speeches. Just two people acknowledging damage. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't offer it on demand," I replied. He nodded. "Fair." That was progress. The trust continued to grow. So did my distance from the need to be understood by everyone. One afternoon, I visited Hawthorne Agri-Supply for the last time. Not as a consultant, not as a founder, as a guest. The receptionist smiled nervously. "Ms. Whitaker." "Just Lorraine," I said. I walked through the building slowly, noticing what I no longer carried. No obligation, no resentment, no vigilance. When I left, I didn't look back. Because revenge, I learned, isn't about destruction. It's about removal. Removing yourself from the roles designed to shrink you. And somewhere between winter and spring, I had done exactly that. But the final reckoning hadn't arrived yet. It never does when you expect it. It arrives when you've already moved on. The final reckoning didn't arrive with a phone call or a court notice. It arrived in a sealed envelope, slipped under my door on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. No return address. Inside was a single document and a handwritten note. The document was a plea agreement. Dana's name sat at the top, spelled exactly as it had always been, confident and sharp. Beneath it were paragraphs dense with legal language outlining civil liability, financial restitution, and a voluntary withdrawal from all pending claims. The handwritten note was brief. "You win. I just want this to stop." I sat at my dining table for a long time. The afternoon light stretching across the wood grain, dust motes floating like they had nowhere else to be. I hadn't wanted this moment. That surprised me. For months, everything had been movement. Strategy, reaction, precision. I had imagined closure as something loud, something satisfying, something that would feel like justice tightening its grip. Instead, it felt like exhaustion leaving my body all at once. Richard called an hour later. "She's finished," he said. No appeals, no counters. She agreed to terms that effectively remove her from any leadership role tied to Hawthorne or its affiliates. "And Mark?" I asked. "He cooperated," Richard replied. "Not against her personally, against the actions." I closed my eyes. That night, I slept without waking once. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of town, where Hawthorne's first warehouse had once stood. It was gone now, replaced by a logistics hub owned by another company entirely. Progress, they would call it. I parked and sat in my car, remembering the smell of dust and fertilizer, the echo of voices bouncing off concrete walls, the way we used to laugh when things went wrong, because laughter was cheaper than panic. That version of me had been strong. This version was quieter. Mark called just after noon. "I read the agreement," he said. "She's done." "Yes," I replied. There was a pause. Then, "I don't know how to live with what I allowed." "You live honestly," I said. "It's the only way that lasts." He exhaled. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I know," I said. We talked for a while about practical things. Emily's school, his plans to move into a smaller place, therapy. Silence where it belonged. When the call ended, I realized something essential. The revenge everyone imagines is dramatic. The revenge that actually heals is quiet. Later that week, the Trust hosted its first annual report. Not flashy, no press, just numbers, outcomes. Names of women who had re-entered the workforce or negotiated severance instead of disappearing. One woman had secured a board seat. Another had started her own consultancy. A third had finally walked away without guilt. I watched from the back of the room, unseen, and felt something settle. This wasn't about Dana anymore. It never had been. It was about refusing to let the end of your usefulness be decided by someone who benefited from your silence. That night, I burned the last of the old documents in my fireplace. Not out of anger, out of trust. Trust in myself. By summer, my life no longer revolved around what had been taken. It revolved around what I chose. I started volunteering twice a week at a small business incubator run out of a converted library. Women over 50 came in with notebooks and nervous smiles, pitching ideas they'd been told were too late. I listened, more than I spoke. When they asked how I did it, I didn't talk about revenge. I talked about clarity. One afternoon, a woman named Patricia pulled me aside. She was 61, recently divorced, recently fired. "They say I'm outdated," she whispered. I met her eyes. "They say that when they don't want competition." She laughed softly, like someone remembering how. That evening, I received an email from Mark. "Emily wants to know if she can spend a week with you in August." I smiled. Yes. When Emily arrived, she brought a suitcase, a stack of books, and questions she didn't yet know how to ask. We baked, we walked, we talked about everything, except Dana. One night, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies, she said, "Dad says you didn't fight back, that you just waited." I considered that. "I didn't wait," I said. "I prepared." She nodded slowly. "That's scarier." I laughed. In September, Hawthorne Agri Supply announced a new leadership structure. My name wasn't mentioned. That felt right. In October, the trust received its first major donation from an anonymous source. The note attached read, "For the woman who taught me not to disappear quietly." I never found out who sent it. I didn't need to. On a crisp morning in November, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the same place where this all began. The house felt different now. Not emptier, lighter. I thought about how many women had been told their power expired, quietly. How many had been managed out of relevance, with polite smiles and concern. Revenge didn't give me my old life back. It gave me something better. Choice. If this story found you because you've been labeled difficult, inconvenient, or outdated, hear this. You are not obsolete. You are experienced. And experience terrifies people who rely on your silence. If this story resonated with you, like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about dignity, truth, and the kind of justice that doesn't shout, but always arrives. The first Thanksgiving I hosted after everything ended, I set the table for fewer people than before. That felt like progress. I cooked slowly that morning, not because I needed help, but because I enjoyed the rhythm of it. Chopping vegetables, letting the turkey roast without checking it every 10 minutes, listening to the radio instead of rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Mark arrived alone. No Dana. No explanations. He stood in the doorway holding a bottle of wine, uncertainty written across his face, like a man unsure whether he was a guest or a trespasser. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Come in," I replied. That was all. We didn't hug. We didn't avoid each other either. We moved around the kitchen like two people learning new rules without a manual. Halfway through dinner, he cleared his throat. "I sold my shares," he said. I looked up, surprised despite myself. "To who?" I asked. "To the trust," he replied. "At a discount. I didn't want to profit from something that started wrong." That was new. Not guilt. Responsibility. I nodded once. "Thank you." He exhaled, relieved I hadn't made it heavier. Later, as we sat with coffee, he asked quietly, "Do you ever miss her?" I considered the question carefully. "I miss who I thought she was," I said. "I don't miss who she chose to be." He nodded. "That's fair." Emily arrived the next morning, all energy and curiosity, carrying a school project about women leaders. She asked if she could interview me. "For history," she said. "For truth," I replied. She recorded my voice on her phone as I talked about contracts, negotiation, and what it means to walk away before bitterness takes root. "Did you get revenge?" she asked at the end. I smiled softly. I got free. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen. Same room, same table, different woman. I thought about how close I'd come to being defined by someone else's version of my usefulness, and how quietly I had refused. The following spring, I turned 69. There was no party, no speeches, just a handful of cards, a phone call from Mark, and a handwritten note from Patricia, the woman who once whispered that she was outdated. She had started her consultancy. She had her first client. She wrote, "You were right. They weren't afraid of my age. They were afraid of my memory." I folded the note and placed it in the cedar chest, the same one that once held evidence and contingency plans. Now, it held gratitude. The trust reached a milestone that year. 100 women supported, some through grants, some through legal guidance, some simply through knowing they weren't alone or imagining things. I never put my name on the website. Power doesn't need credit when it's doing its job. One afternoon, I ran into Dana by accident. A grocery store 2 towns over. A different haircut. Cheaper shoes. Her confidence replaced by something brittle. She froze when she saw me. I didn't. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to negotiate. I walked past her without a word. That was the moment I knew it was truly over. Not because she had fallen, but because she no longer occupied any space inside me. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun drop behind the trees. The air smelled like cut grass and distance. I felt no triumph, no regret, just alignment. If you're listening to this and you're at the beginning of your own story, standing in a room where people are smiling while quietly replacing you, remember this: you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't need permission to document the truth. And revenge doesn't have to be loud to be complete. Sometimes it looks like a woman reclaiming her name, her work, and her future, without asking to be let back in. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to like it, share your thoughts or experiences in the comments, and subscribe if you want more stories about betrayal, justice, and the quiet power of women who refuse to disappear.